Good evening, everyone. My name is Arnie Eisen. I'm the Chancellor of JTS, and I'm happy to welcome everyone to this year's Henry and Selma S. Rappaport Memorial Lecture. Excuse me, it's spring. It really is spring, and I can tell you that because the allergies kicked in this morning at about 6:30 a.m., so it is now officially spring. So please forgive me for the allergized voice. At this time, I'd like to remind everybody, 2 weeks before Passover, exactly 2 weeks, to perform the pre-Pesach ritual of turning off your cell phones if they're not already off. For those who are here at JTS for the first time, welcome, and I hope you'll be back very often to be with us this year. I'm delighted to welcome, in addition to those in the room, all of our live stream viewers from around the world. It's wonderful that we're able to share tonight's program with you. We're also pleased and excited at the number of synagogues and other organizations that have partnered JTS for public screenings of tonight's program. I have a partial list of the groups. We're happy to welcome members of Congregation Shaarei Tzedek in Southfield, Michigan, of Temple Beth Shalom in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, of Temple Israel in Albany, New York, of Beth David Synagogue in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the Rutland Jewish Center in Rutland, Vermont, and any others that I know about. Welcome. We're really happy to have you here. It's our great pleasure this evening to be joined by tonight's presenters, Abigail Pogrebin and Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who will discuss Ms. Pogrebin's hot-off-the-press book, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew. So, Abby, I don't know how many times you've been introduced this way, but at JTS I have to say that you are an amazing Jewish educator. And I just wish that every Jewish educator we have is as creative a mind and as good a writer and as accessible a writer as Abby is in this amazing book. I can testify that I've already stolen 3 ideas for our Passover seder from the Passover chapter, right? We're going to do the debate, Oxford Union style, about whether Pharaoh should be condemned or not, or sympathized with. But there are other, and I think you'll be sure. The bonus for tonight is you're going to come away with at least 3 ideas, if not more, for your Passover Seder. And Abby is joined by another major Jewish educator, I think is used to being introduced as a major Jewish educator. Joe Telushkin is one of the most important and influential Jewish educators of our time. And to have the two of them at JTS discussing Abby's book, which is available for us, and 2 of Joseph's books are also available to us for signing after the program. Let me just say a few words about the Rappaport lecture, and then I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague, Michal Springer. This annual lecture was originally endowed in 1982 by Mrs. Selma Rappaport, Zichronah Livracha, a past president of the Women's League of Conservative Judaism and a longtime member of the JTS board. Was she the only woman on the JTS board at that time, Mike? Do you know? She must have been almost the only member, if not the only woman member of the board at that time, in memory of her husband, Henry and Rappaport. And now, of course, the family has continued the lecture in honor of both of them. Henry Rappaport was a distinguished attorney and committed Jew, that's an understatement, who served as the president of Temple Israel Center in White Plains and later as the president of United Synagogue. He was an active member of the JTS board as well, and a generous benefactor of JTS's scholarly programs. I'm pleased to say that the Rappaport family is really well represented tonight. Michael and his wife Joanne, and David and his wife Deborah, as well as other family members who are here this evening. Welcome, all of you, and thank you very much on behalf of JTS for the continuing support of the Rappaport lecture. It's a great tradition, and we hope it will carry on for a long time to come. And now I'm pleased to turn the program over to Rabbi Michal Springer, Director of JTS's Center for Pastoral Education. The center is co-sponsoring tonight's program, and Rabbi Springer was instrumental in, how do we say this, in making the shidduch with her good friend Abby that has resulted in us all being together here tonight. So Michal, the program is yours. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Chancellor Eisen, and thank you to the Rappaport family. Very grateful for your generosity and to be here in the Women's League Seminary Synagogue, which your mother was part of in building up Women's League. How beautiful. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight. The Center for Pastoral Education teaches religious leaders how to listen deeply, to journey with people who are searching, with people who are wondering. So I can't think of anybody I would rather introduce than Abigail Pogrebin, the author of her new book, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wondering Jew, and Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who has been a guide to many wandering Jews over many years. I have witnessed Abigail's journey and have been blessed to be part of it for a long time. I'm inspired by your passion, by your openness, by your spiritual thirst, and your intellectual rigor. Even if you weren't my friend, I would still be so moved by the conversation that you have introduced into the public and are having with us tonight, which is so essential and which you have come by so authentically and persuasively. I have seen your impact, and I look forward to having your impact grow as you continue to address audiences in the publication, after the publication of your book. In addition, Abigail has also written Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talk About Being Jewish, and it was made into a fabulous musical, which I've had the privilege of seeing. And One and the Same, My Life as an Identical Twin, and What I've Learned About Everyone's Struggle to Be Singular. She's a former producer for Mike Wallace at 60 Minutes and for Charlie Rose at PBS, and she's written for numerous publications, including New York Magazine, The Daily Beast, The Forward, and Tablet. She also moderates conversations at the JCC in Manhattan, the 92nd Street Y, the Skirball Center, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and the Samuel Bronfman Foundation. Abigail has single-handedly made it chic to be Jewish. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, named by Talk magazine as one of the 50 best speakers in the United States, pretty cool, is the author of Jewish Literacy, the most important things to know about the Jewish religion, its people, and its history. The most widely selling book on Judaism of the past 2 decades, Jewish Literacy has been hailed by leading figures in all of the major movements of Judaism. Another book that Rabbi Telushkin has written is Hillel, If Not Now, When, which he wrote for Next Book Press, and my husband had the honor of editing, Jonathan Rosen. So I can tell you from secondhand experience, listening to Jonathan talk about Joseph's incredible process of writing, that he is both, as you all know, erudite and an amazing guide, and also very down-to-earth, profound, but not in a way that makes the rest of us feel inadequate, which is a hard thing to do. His insights into our tradition and living Jewishly today have enabled many of us to draw closer, and that is an amazing gift in a time when we all know that that drawing closer is what's most essential in order for us to hold on to the Jewish community going into the future. Among his many other works is the Book of Jewish Values, a day-by-day guide to ethical living, which was the subject of a PBS special entitled Moral Imagination that aired throughout the United States. He is also co-author with Dennis Prager of one of the most influential Jewish books published in the last 35 years, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. Our program tonight will proceed as follows. Abigail Pogrebin and Joseph Telushkin will now discuss Abigail's new book and the issues it raises. And following that, we will invite questions from the audience. I'm now pleased to invite our presenters to begin what promises to be a most illuminating evening.
Thank you.
A central theme in your book, and I would guess in your life, is the pursuit of knowledge. And the fact you don't like being in a situation where you don't think you know enough. And that keeps coming up in your book. Concerning observant Jews, you wrote early in your book, I envied not their certainty, but their literacy. When you were involved in your early 20s with a non-Jewish man, you questioned, how would I teach
Are we really starting with that, Joseph?
You questioned, how would I teach our children what I didn't know myself? But it's not knowledge about Judaism, it's in all areas. You write of, having mentioned the man you were involved with in your 20s, you wrote about your first date with your husband, David, who's here. I hope this isn't going off in a direction she wasn't expecting.
Oh my God, entirely.
I had never felt such an instantaneous certainty about knowing someone without knowing them. So this is almost in nature more of an observation than a real question. But I think this is a real dominant sort of theme in your life, the pursuit of knowledge and how do you access knowledge and how other things.
Wow. First of all, I admit to a little bit of insecurity here, which I know I shouldn't, but I am in this conversation with a giant, someone who I have admired forever. His book is my gift to every bar and bat mitzvah and confirmant and married person. So I just want to say that it's an honor before I go down in flames.
Thank you.
You've made me think I should switch therapists because you've touched on something very real. I think that, and my editor kept saying this to me, it seems like your door to feeling is learning. And that was not something I was aware of so much until I became sort of enamored with our tradition and all of its teachings. I didn't notice that that's how I was coming to emotion or even spirituality, which is a word I don't use easily. So I would say that you're right that I need to understand to feel engaged. And there are certain things that are instinctual, like meeting my husband. And it's something that I hope my children feel when it's their turn, God willing, where I didn't need a lot of information. I definitely was peppering him on our first date, to be sure. But you're right, it was much more of a gut response. I feel like when I was investigating the holidays, I started in a way, not with a challenge, but it was sort of skepticism of saying, why should Shmini Atzeret mean something to us in 2014, 15? How can that possibly live in, not just in our imaginations, but in our daily lives? And that was sort of the organizing question, I would say, throughout this entire architecture that is our Jewish holidays, which is, tell me why. But, Passover, I think we all can connect to, and Yom Kippur, obviously the top five. But when you look at what is demanded of a Jew, obviously it's very demanding, and you live it, and I don't. I think it is a difficult threshold question, is to say, why should this speak to me today?
And I think, and that's what was very striking to me, because I think what we also both do share in common is it's the pursuit of knowledge aspect of Judaism that very much entrances us. I never, as easily, in recent years, I've gotten more into tefillah, more into prayer, but what is the study tradition of Judaism, and it's a religion that begins, and you shall teach it to your children, and it has often struck me the role of questioning in Judaism. I would venture to guess, and I'd be curious by a showing of hands, how many of you was your first speaking in public the asking of the Manishtana, the 4 questions at a seder? I'd expect for, and that's a very, very fascinating thing. God early on in the Bible says, Ayeka, where are you? And Abraham, of course, challenges God with questions. I remember years ago seeing an interview that had appeared with Isidore Rabi, the physicist who was Jewish and who had won the Nobel Prize. And they asked him, how did you become a scientist? And he said, most of the other kids, when I was growing up on the Lower East Side, when they came home from school, their mothers would say to them, what did you learn in school today? And my mother said to me, Izzy, did you ask any good questions today? So I think, that's part of it. And I was very struck by that aspect of you, of the asking of questions. You were constantly pursuing the knowledge, just out of curiosity. And I'm asking this for selfish reasons. This might be helpful to me, too. What did you find out about Shmini Atzeret?
First of all, that very few rabbis can explain it. No, I actually, it was one of the more meaningful takeaways, which was the idea of Atzeret means stop, that we stop with God, that we have one more day, that after this rush, which I had not anticipated, holidays being like a clown car in the fall, where you open the door and they keep coming. And I was trying to keep up both with learning, observing, and then digesting and writing about it, so I was particularly frenzied. And I thought, there is sort of a purpose to this frenzy. It's not just the piling on of holidays, where you start, if you predate it to Elul, you really start Atonement in the summer, and it's a whirlwind all the way through. This is the stop, this is where you've basically come to the end, but the idea that God is saying, stay back one more day. I thought, first of all, the idea, I thought it was sort of audacious that I could even expect God to spend that kind of time with me. But also that idea that God, whatever God is for people, does not want us to go quite yet. And I think that there is the rigor of atonement, and then obviously Sukkot has its own joy but demands, and the idea that you're not quite done is something that has stayed with me. It's an intimate holiday.
Now, what's interesting is, so on the one hand, you come across, one wandering Jew, but this has been a very, I think, interesting theme in your life, because I remember you write about the fact that when you got married, you wanted to have a very traditional wedding. You wanted the chuppah. So has the attraction to tradition always been very much a part of you? You said you were influenced by Fiddler on the Roof, the image of it. And I'll tell you a funny story. I was once at a hotel in LA, and there was a man, clearly with his grandson, in the swimming pool, and I could tell from his English accent that he was Israeli. Whenever I would be in Israel and I'd ask somebody a question in Hebrew, my accent is so strong, they'd always answer in English. So I always love when I recognize an Israeli English accent to start speaking to them in Hebrew. And we're in LA, so I asked him, we're talking, I said to the man, what do you do? And he said, I'm an actor, which is not an uncommon answer in LA. I said, have you been in any films I might have seen? He said, yes, Fiddler. I said, what role did you play? He said, I was Tevye, so it was Tuple. I was immediately, but I want you to know, so we're talking, I think I had my kippah on, so he found out I was a rabbi. You know what he was very proud of? He said, I understand that because of Fiddler, he said, before Fiddler, he said in the non-Orthodox world, it was not at all common at weddings that they would lift people up on chairs and start dancing around them. And he said, I feel that we helped reintroduce that. So have you always had that sort of attraction to tradition?
Well, Fiddler was my first show at 4 years old, so yes, it's indelible. But I think it is it's such a cliche, but a cliche that endures for a reason. I think I had both an attraction and an aversion to tradition, and I don't think I'm alone in that. There were things about it that seemed very restricting, and there were things that seemed attractive. But to your earlier point about knowledge, the fact that I lacked it, had only the basic rudimentary understanding growing up, made me actually resist tradition because I felt like it would make me feel dumb and inadequate and ill-equipped. So I do sometimes think we are not as honest as we should be about the fact that there are sometimes Jews that might be more interested or intrigued but feel like that ship has sailed and it's too late, and so they don't opt for one tradition or a ritual or an institutional Jewish life at all because they don't want to be kind of called out in their ignorance. And I think that was operating for me in terms of thinking it was kind of too late for me. And coming to it late, even with this book, you raise a good point about tefillah. Prayer is still hard for me. And even with all of the moments of incredible, intense feeling and almost revelation that I had in the reporting and the experiencing of this book, I think that some of the hardest moments were around prayer for me.
Now, we're meeting here at the CPE program under the direction of Michal Springer, who is your friend going back to Yale, and who's a big hero in my house.
She married me.
She married you, and who's a big hero in my house because my wife, Devora, is studying in the CPE program with Michal. I remember you have a fascinating insight in your book about Hanukkah and the argument between Hillel and Shammai. We all know that the tradition is we light one candle the first night and then in successive nights. Shammai argued we should start with 8. And you tell a very fascinating insight about that story, and I think you got that insight from Rabbi Springer.
Michal was my Hanukkah interview, and so we talked about a whole other aspect of Hanukkah that I was struggling with, which was discovering for the first time that it wasn't just Jew against Greek, Syrian Greek, but Jew against Jew, which we can get to. But then I was also interested in the idea of light. I kept hearing about light from rabbis. I didn't want it to be the hallmark story of light. I mean, I give it to those of us who grew up with the menorah and loved that, the fact that the house was lit in that tradition. But I knew there was more to it because I kept hearing about it. And At the time that I interviewed her, my father-in-law was struggling and kind of towards the end of his days. And as I found, as I'm sure you know, but was a discovery to me, every place that I went personally in that year was absolutely met by the holiday that I was celebrating. And I found that that ended up being no accident in terms of the tradition rising to meet you where you are. And so I talked to Michal, who knew that we were losing Milt, and she talked about this debate between Hillel and Shammai as to how to properly light the menorah. And that even though Hillel essentially won and we all light it that way, she talked about the power of starting with so much light and the diminishing of the light, and the fact that as we take the candles away, who is left? The people around the menorah. We gather to light it as a family, as a group. That's who's left when all the lights go out. And I was literally watching that happen at my father-in-law's hospital bed, which was that people kept coming, the family was there, and even as the diminishing light was evident to us, we all had each other. So it was one of those, flicker of teachings that has stayed with me.
Wow. And I'm also thinking the Jewish community is so concerned with, maintaining the identity of Jews and focuses a lot on children with holidays. But what I've learned to appreciate very much from the work that Devorah is doing at the Jewish home here on 106th Street with Rabbi Malamy there, how important holidays are to the older people there. And as she has told me, she's amazed the extent to which the Shabbat service defines the week for many of the residents there, that many other people who don't have any sort of spiritual connection, one week just drifts into another. And also how for so many people it takes them back to their youth, and because that's for most people their early associations with the holidays and with that. And the importance, as she said, even when people don't know Hebrew, and most of the residents there don't really know Hebrew, how it penetrates them with a sense of holiness. And I remember something I had once read in a writing of the late Rabbi Arnold Jacob Wolf. He said, it's interesting, how much Hebrew do we need to have in the service, how important it is. And he was arguing on behalf of keeping a lot of Hebrew in. But Arnie Wolf, he was making the point. He said, the rabbis actually, though, were very liberal on that you could say the Shema in another language. He said, yet I've never even heard of the most left-wing temple that wants to say the Shema in any language other than Hebrew, because of the power of the Hebrew to really penetrate. Did you learn much Hebrew during this year, or
Well, I had a tutor, and it was not my finest hour, but I'm still working on it. I feel like that was one of the barriers, was not being fast enough or fluid enough. But so much of the teaching when I interviewed rabbis was using the Hebrew as as the gateway to the holiday. So I would learn it, but again, I think that's part of the tefillah struggle, is not being faster.
Okay. One of the things I'm grateful to you is it sort of forced me in the reading of your book to rethink my own holidays experiences. Well, one thing, because I want to give you a chance to say something really quite specific, Chancellor Eisen, in his introduction, said how his seder is going to be influenced by what you wrote about. What are some of the specific things that mark off? And you, of course, had an unusual experience with the seder, because in addition to the traditional seder, which you also had the seder that your mom was one of the originators of.
Right, the feminist seder.
Yeah, the feminist seder.
Yeah.
With Bella Abzug and Gloria Steinem.
She used to come, yeah.
Yeah. So what are some of the things, because everybody here is always anxious to learn new things to liven up our Seder.
Right. Well, first of all, I would say that what was wonderful about when I was writing this was I had an email account. I was writing it originally for the Forward newspaper. And as you know, the minute you open up a conversation Jewishly, people flood in. So I had kind of a crowdsourced a group giving me ideas all the time. But I have really been led, frankly, by being a parent, and also remembering very acutely being at my uncle Danny, my cousin Danny, and my uncle Bernie's seders, and as much as I loved them, being really uninspired by the Haggadah and the fact that we were kind of turning pages after pages and eating, peanuts to try to stave off our hunger, and really excited about the karpas when it arrived.
Right.
And I thought, I don't want my kids to have that same kind of looking at your watch. I want them to be so captivated that they actually have forgotten about whether they've eaten or not. Which is a high bar, but every teaching, as you know, is that main mitzvah, tell it to the children. And I thought, so this can't just be about a circus for the kids. This has to be about fulfilling the commandment. So how do you do that? And I kind of started there and went backwards, which is, I don't think, I'm sort of evangelical about this, that enough parents or Seder leaders have gone to the text, have gone to what's there as a way to enliven it. It's often kind of songs that are a little bit silly and, putting some of the frogs on the table. All of that is great. I've done those things. But I do feel like the Seder, the Exodus is one of the most dramatic stories, as we all know, that exists. And the stakes are very high, and they're very understandable to a 12-year-old or even a 10-year-old. So I have suggestions, which I've done as my kids are now older now, but we, started with participation. I don't think that the Manashtana should be the only time that they step up. So I would send out the 12 sections that I wanted to offer up for the kids, and you could choose one and you had to explain it. So someone took the Seder plate, someone took the matzah, someone took the plagues. It's your job to bring that to us and to explain it to us. So immediately the kids have something to do. They would find their own creative way of bringing it to the table, but they had to research it. They had to understand it enough. As they got older, things have gotten a little more competitive, but that's kind of the Pogrebin family, and that's why I am in therapy. So we have debates where I put basically a position under people's plates, and I call on two people, and I have chosen those positions, and they have to argue them. They have a minute to do it. But again, it's going to the text. So what Chancellor Eisen mentioned was one of them was because Pharaoh's heart was hardened, according to the Exodus text. What does that mean? Does that mean that he is not as culpable? Because when he might have been, his instinct might have been to free the Israelites, he somehow was affected by God in choosing not to. So that's just one of the positions that Pharaoh is not as guilty as we say he is, and then the other position that he's entirely guilty. And the last thing I would just mention is Speed Magid. The Magid is obviously the story.
Right.
I often found it to be the most confusing part of the service because it's a little patchwork, and it was never clear to me that it was actually a narrative that was taken from the Torah but isn't necessarily running through the whole Haggadah. So we play, again, it's timed, which creates pressure, but I think kids are used to that, and they actually want to rise to knowing something. So I have like 25 questions and 2 teams and 2 bells, and each representative comes up, and we run through the questions, and hopefully you do well.
Okay.
There's matzah for you at the end of it.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. No, as I said, it brought me back to memories of my own Seder. I remember one of the things, all of the kids, we would collectively steal the afikomen, and we had a cousin, Steve Vladik, who was a labor lawyer, and he negotiated. He negotiated on our behalf what we would get. I learned early on it's good to have a lawyer. Yes. And my grandfather was a great scholar. He introduced his own thing. Given the world that he came out of, it was very mainstream, very orthodox world, but we always concluded our Seder with singing the Hatikva, because this was really in the early days of the state of Israel.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
One of the things that was really new to me was the pour out thy wrath prayer, because we did not incorporate it growing up.
Right.
Is that in your book? You talk about it, and it's obviously become somewhat or became controversial. Do you include it in your Seder, and how do you position it?
Yes.
Can you explain?
Okay. Yeah. The pour out thy wrath, shfoch hamatcha, is an appeal to God. It's about the nations that oppressed us. It's not an appeal against all non-Jews. By the way, it's interesting. The actual language of it, people often think it means pour out your wrath on Gentiles who knew thee not. But if you actually look at it, it could even apply to the Jewish nation. Because remember, even in the Torah, everybody knows today that the word goy means a non-Jew. But in the Torah, it really means a nation. The Jews are referred to as a goy in the Torah. And you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a goy kadosh, and a holy nation. So I think, given the nature of Jewish history, that every once in a while we wanted God. We often feel we were always that protected by God, and we wanted the people who had done bad things to us to suffer somewhat as a result. It's not a dominant theme, but I think it is a theme.
Are you comfortable with it?
I'm not uncomfortable with it. I don't want to, to this day, I find that I have an enormous anger at evil people. And I do want to see evil people in some way suffer for their evil. Now, again, there's the classic story in the Talmud where Rabbi Meir wanted that to happen, and his wife, Bruria, said to him, well, why don't you pray that they repent, and then they won't be evil people anymore, which would be fine, but I think we're talking about people who can maybe have done some things that are beyond repentance. So I'm really not that uncomfortable. If it was a dominant theme, yes. Now, it's funny, I'll tell you a funny story it just reminded me of. Through an odd series of events, one year we had the actor Kirk Douglas at our seder, and Devorah had arranged our children were putting on a Passover skit. They were still quite young, and then Devorah said to him, well, Kirk, how could you be at our seder and for doing acting, not act? So he took the role of Pharaoh. And we asked him, so what do you think of this seder? He says, you Jews are a bunch of ingrates. You think I'm stupid? You don't think I realized who my daughter had brought home, that it was one of those Jewish kids, and I spared him? Do you ever once mention that I spared your greatest? And I thought, he had this great ability, Kirk, even when he played a bad guy, to find, that person's justification. But again, I don't think it's at all a dominant theme. And as a result, I'm not that uncomfortable with it. It's almost like I say, people say, there's vindictiveness, and I don't think Jews, by and large, are vindictive people. I'll give you an example of what I mean. The greatest crime ever committed against the Jews was obviously the Holocaust. And when I was growing up in the 50s, so a lot of Jews wouldn't buy German products and, Volkswagens and things like that. That was about the nature and the depth of Jewish vindictiveness. And some people said, no, that's going too far. You shouldn't boycott any German products. I mean, it's not like we were, by and large, carrying out terrorist acts or anything else. So I think people also need to be able to have an outlet sometime to do that, particularly around a holiday like Passover, which in medieval Jewish history was often marred by people accusing Jews of a blood libel. And how could people not want there to be, some recompense for it? Okay, do I gather from your question you are uncomfortable with it?
No, I think it's an interesting question to introduce at the table, but to realize that it is somewhat antithetical to the theme and the messaging of the Seder, which is a much more outstretched arm kind of a message. And this one is revenge. And I personally have had those feelings, but I think I'm glad, in other words, I think it should be at the Seder table. Obviously, maybe 10-year-olds shouldn't talk about killing our enemies, but I think whitewashing it was a mistake for those who have chosen to excise it.
Right.
But I think you have to call out that it is actually asking God to avenge us, essentially.
Well, look, we even find arguments in the Jewish Midrash and Aggadic material about Moses' killing of the Egyptian who was beating the Jew. And, some people said he had no right to do it. He shouldn't have killed the person or that. And then, strangely enough, I have my own Midrash on it. A few years ago, I went to see the film 12 Years a Slave. And there's which had won the Academy Award that year. And there is a horrific scene there where a man is whipping a black woman, urged on to do so by his wife, and I remember all I was hoping was somebody would step in and kill the guy, So I think we want to, acknowledge and acknowledge those things. You quote Avi Weiss as one of the people that you've interviewed, and by the way, I want to point out, this is as a rabbi, I'm happy to see she quotes 51 rabbis in the book, and they were all smart. And they were good. So this is a good book for the rabbis. Avi makes the point that I think he was in the context of talking about Yom HaShoah, that nothing in Jewish history is ever remembered without ritual. What were So what affected you? You write about the ritual that's evolving here concerning Yom HaShoah, of reading out of names.
Yeah. So Yom HaShoah, I found all the modern holidays, and you write about this too, have had a harder time sticking, I think, partly because they're newer, but partly because Chaim Seidler-Feller, another rabbi from UCLA Hillel, said Jews don't do well without a table. And I think that's true. There's nothing very clear for the Jews to do, for us to do around these rituals. Yom HaShoah, I obviously wanted to do something, and it wasn't so easy to find out what there was to be done. People are hearing from survivors, that has happened, but ritually I wanted to find something. So the JCC, in partnership with BJ, B'nai Jeshurun, has this remarkable tradition which starts at 10 p.m. at night of the reading of the names. They get these lists from Yad Vashem, the Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. It's a shattering book, obviously, and I failed it because I came up with my reading glasses, which weren't strong enough, and in the dim light, the names were so small because they try to obviously pack as many as they can. You know, Joy Levitt, Rabbi Joy Levitt, who is one of the organizers and the JCC's executive director, said to me that they've been doing this for however many, I think 13, 15 years, and they're not through Belgium. I mean, it's shattering. But I would say what Avi Weiss proposed was much more uncomfortable for me. And he believes in it, which is to essentially have a Yom HaShoah seder. Just as we, quote, reenact the Exodus, we should reenact the Holocaust, and that if we don't do that, this is not going to be memory that sustains, that unless you do as we say, which is that you should taste that bitter herb and go back and be a slave. This was his argument. And obviously, when I talked to Menachem Rosensaft, who is a Holocaust survivor, he said that is, it's anathema to imagine that we can reenact a horror like that. But Rabbi Weiss was not alone in saying, unless we ritualize this, when the survivors are gone, there will not be a way to activate this memory other than a history book, and it will be in peril. So
it's fascinating, because I was just reading in a newspaper a few days ago, apparently some professor at Howard University, the historic black university, tried to do a scene showing like a sale of a slave, and it was he was white, and he obviously should have talked it through, and it was very offensive. So I don't know what that would mean, and I don't know exactly to what extent, Avi is feeling how we should do it. By the way, it's interesting, you quoted Chaim. It's like all these names, Chaim Seidler-Feller and I went to Camp Masad together. And having said how nicely Michal spoke, Rabbi Springer spoke about Jonathan Rosen's editing my book, I want you to know, I've had wonderful editors of my books. He's the only editor I had to whom I actually dedicated the book.
Oh, wow.
So he's quite remarkable.
He is amazing.
Okay, so, but you quoted Chaim Seidler-Feller as making the comment, no holidays survive without a table? Is that what you said? Okay, so let me ask you this. Obviously, Yom Kippur is the exception. Right. But even in the case of Yom Kippur, the meal following Yom Kippur is given an official name, the break fast.
Right. It's a highlight.
Yeah, that right. And I know no shortage of people who don't fast on Yom Kippur, but look forward to the break fast. So, but you went through, you did the whole thing. You observed all the, quote, minor fast days. I know that there are many, you quote Leon Wieseltier as making the point to you, what is going to stick with you, and, and things that you do that you'll want to perpetuate. Outside of Yom Kippur, do you want to perpetuate any of the other fast days based on your own experience?
It's a hard one. I'm an avid eater, so I didn't love the 6 fasts. But I would say that I would want to perpetuate or hold on to the teachings. And I know that sounds like kind of a Pollyannish answer, but it's true. I mean, they have stayed with me, particularly the 10th of Tevet, which is the beginning of the first of the 4. I don't have to tell you, but for those who aren't sure, it's the siege of the temple and in the 4 stages of destruction. And the teaching that I got was from Yosef Blau of YU, Yeshiva University, who said, that holiday should remind us to pay attention to the beginning of bad things. We shouldn't wait for something to be awful. Pay attention to the clouds before the storm. So that has certainly resurrected itself without being political in these last months. And then on the fact that there was an argument over whether the 10th of Tevet should be the Holocaust memorial.
Right.
And the idea that rabbis were still deciding what should be our traditions and what shouldn't was really a revelation to me, that they were thinking that should actually be the Holocaust memorial, because it was kind of a day that was not so
Observed,
rich, not so observed, and that they lost that argument, and Yom HaShoah won out. So just the idea that we are this fluid, that tradition is being developed. And I would say the last thing is for the 17th of Tammuz, which is obviously in the summer, which I didn't love, there was an incredible teaching by Elena Steinhain, who's with Shalom Hartman. And she said this was the breach of the temple, where basically they were done and they knew they were going down. So it's the knowing, the in-between. She described that liminal space between the knowing it's over and it actually ending. And that she said, how many of us have seen, God willing, we haven't been in this situation, where we know the end is there, but we have to go through it. And to me, again, watching my father-in-law and then this friend of mine who died of cancer also in this year, and knowing that she knew that this was an inevitable finish, but she had to move through it with these two children, 5 and 7 years old. She had to walk that walk. That's something that has stayed with me.
Yeah.
The fasting, I'm not sure I'll repeat.
No, I know Tisha B'Av remains for me very strong, because Tisha B'Av is the only full fast aside from Yom Kippur, and it really does commemorate the tragedies of Jewish life. But you're saying that you could learn to find meaning even in others. In probably one of the least observed of the fast days is Tzom Gedalia, which they always had to have a joke always about Tzom Gedalia. A man says, ask somebody, do you fast in Tzom Gedalia? He says, no. He says, why not? He says, first of all, it was 2,500 years ago. If he hadn't died then, he'd be dead by now anyway. Secondly, if I had died, Gedalia wouldn't have fasted for me. And third, if I don't fast on Yom Kippur, why should I fast on Tzom Gedalia? But I remember in the aftermath of Tzom Gedalia, I was speaking to my friend J.J. Goldberg, and he said, the last time a Jewish head of state was assassinated by a Jew, they declared a fast day that we still observed. He was saying that obviously in the immediate aftermath of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. So even that, it's funny because we're so aware of the rabbinic teaching about sinat chinam, causeless hatred within the Jewish community. And you've, of course, also mentioned it. You make reference to Sam Friedman's Jew versus Jew. And I know that that's been important. And I know that you have felt very hurt as, in light of your commitment to Central Synagogue, when you see people trying to, you quote,
disparage Reform Jews.
Disparage Reform Judaism and Reform Jews and their commitment, whatever one thinks of it. But with Gedalia, it really is a very important issue. Here he was the head of a Jewish state, and we have to guard against it, because the more passionately, we all want more passion in Jewish life. We all want more passion in life. And we also have to recognize passion can lead, to very, very terrible acts. So that's what I was struck by. I want to ask you, certainly as I think we're approaching
Questions?
the question period, though. You have a great line, a poetic line that I loved in your book. Judaism is a train that circles back to pick you up. So now I'm going to give you the opportunity to be Rashi on your own line. Rashi, of course, comments on everything in the Torah. Obviously, it's something you've thought about, and maybe like great poetry, it shouldn't be commented on. We should just leave it like that. But it really is a powerful line. How did you mean it? Judaism is a train that circles back to pick you up.
Yeah. I think that I first of all appreciate that you call it out. I think that it really was something I thought it was too late for me, and that there were forces in my life. My wonderful mother, who's very attached and very invested in Judaism, being one of them, who hoped that I would feel more than I was feeling for a while, and feeling like I was disappointing her and others, and realizing that I had sort of to be more mundane and talk about Dorothy, come to myself, come home on my own. And I think that's actually, at the end of the day, true of every Jew, of any person of faith at all, that you eventually have to come to your own story in your own time. But I feel like this tradition uniquely is this kind of living, alive. Train is the metaphor that comes to mind. It's racing, and it doesn't need you. I don't think Judaism necessarily needed me or needs any of us. But if you get on it, it's going to take great care of you and going to give you the greatest ride of your life.
That's fantastic. No, that's the very passion. It's like I know that over the years, I have found that the ritual I have, which is hardly a distinctive ritual, of going, immersing myself in the mikveh before Yom Kippur, it's something that I so look forward to, and if I didn't do, and you immerse yourself several times, and I go down, I pray once for the world, once for the Jewish people, and once for my family, and ritual, speaks the language of poetry. I remember Abraham Twersky, the psychiatrist, told me, do any of you, I'm curious, by a showing of hands, how many of you practice, according to Jewish law, the Sabbath is supposed to be inaugurated by lighting 2 Shabbat candles. But there is a custom among some Jews of lighting an additional candle for each child in the household. Do any of you practice that? Right. Anyway, so I remember Rabbi Twersky once told me, he said he grew up in a household, he was the youngest child in the house, and his parents practiced that. And he said, you know how meaningful it was for me as a child that because I existed, I knew that every Friday night there was more light in my parents' house? And I understood at that moment the ability of ritual to speak the language of poetry, because all parents hopefully tell their children how much they love them, and at 25, the kids end up in therapy. My parents never loved me. So this is a very powerful way to express it. So you know what? You took me on a journey. I think you're taking everybody here who's read your book on a journey.
Thank you.
Those of you who haven't are going to go on a journey, and I'm very profoundly grateful to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. What a privilege to hear the two of you in dialogue and to witness how deeply you think about so many aspects of Jewish living that are captured in the course of the year in this palpable way, and you've brought it to life in your conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
We now have an opportunity for everybody who would like to ask, or probably not to get to everybody, but if someone would like to ask questions, we also have our live stream audience, and you'll have a chance to have your questions be asked if you come forward. Rabbi Julia Andelman will voice those questions. Please come to the microphone so that the live stream crowd can also hear when you're asking your question, and please indicate to whom you are addressing your question, to one speaker or both speakers, and keep your questions brief, please, so that our wonderful speakers will have an opportunity to respond.
We need courageous people.
Okay, who wants to ask the second question?
Here comes someone.
Hi, my name is Ben. Thank you both so much for being here and sharing. My question's for you, Abigail, and I was wondering if you could talk about if there are any rituals or holidays that maybe didn't resonate for you, that you were really looking for meaning and you just couldn't find it.
Lag BaOmer. Now, I ended up, I think, twisting myself a little bit into a pretzel there because something was happening in the world that resonated in terms of the respect for Akiva's students. I'm sure there are plenty of observant people who are rolling their eyes at that chapter because it feels like a stretch. It was real for me, but it was the meaning and the resonance even after all of that. What was great about it was that I got to talk to Daniel Matt, who is a Zohar, efficient, what impresario is the word I want. He's the master. And it's always confused me so much of mysticism and how it relates to our tradition and also to our liturgy. So I found that was the most resonant, but it's not a holiday that really became, it didn't come to life for me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We have a question from our live stream viewers. The question is about the relationship between observance and literacy. So going back to the fast days that you talked about, if the observance falls away, you said what you want to keep is the lessons. If the observance falls away, can we still preserve those lessons?
Yeah, and I would ask Joseph as well. He allowed me to call him Joseph, by the way, so don't think I'm being disrespectful.
Thank you, and she insisted I call her Miss Pogrebin.
I don't want to deflect it to him, but it's an ongoing struggle for me that there were things that I would want to do again and things I would not, and knowing that in an observant life you don't get a choice. That said, there are plenty of Orthodox rabbis I interviewed who don't do it all, but I do think that it is the kind of the whole meal that you've signed on to, and so I do have a bit of, I would say, to whoever this question is, a certain sense of not being sure of myself. Having come to these holidays and embraced many of them, but not necessarily wanting to choose a religious life. I feel like I am more observant and I feel more spiritual, but I hesitate to call myself a religious person.
I think the religious observant distinction is an important one, but I wouldn't necessarily draw it the way you've drawn it. In other words, I think somebody can be religiously inclined without being fully observant. By the way, one of the things I want to say about your book, which is a very important feature of it, is you are extraordinarily respectful, and not tactically so, but one feels it's genuinely so, of different manifestations of Judaism. So among her 51 rabbis, there were a fair number of Orthodox rabbis, and you describe everything you do, and conservative Judaism, because you're coming out of the Reformed tradition, with such fairness and such non-judgmentalism, and you're able to pose what you think. Having said that, I think the question is a legitimate one. The whole point of acting in a certain way, well, take even the example that I just gave a few moments ago with Rabbi Twersky, that his parents demonstrated he felt it as an extra love because he lived in the house. So let's say they didn't light the extra candle, but they just remembered always to tell him how much they loved them. The power of rituals is that it works not in an entirely rational way. My wife has assured me on many occasions that I tend to be too rational. And so so it hits us on different levels. And if you're speaking on a purely rational basis, so then you're right. You don't have to observe these rituals. Just inculcate whatever value they are and just remember to keep to that value. But if human beings are not entirely creatures only of rationality and of reason, then those rituals enact things out in a certain way. I remember my friend Dennis Prager told me, I remember once when he was kidding, he said when we were kids, he said one of the advantages of keeping kosher is that you learn certain things are kosher and certain things are treif. You know, you learn that certain things you can and certain things are forbidden. I remember it was in the context he was telling me that when he was 6 years old, the first words he learned to read in English were pure vegetable shortening only. And he said it was a good thing to learn at the age of 6 that he couldn't have every candy bar in the candy store. So again, it teaches self-discipline in a variety of ways. So if I'm answering your question in the general abstract, that's right. As a general rule, you can't assume you can drop the rituals if you think they're communicating an important lesson. Now, it's possible that you started feeling at certain points that the lessons they were communicating might have just been self-discipline without, or, that it didn't touch you on some other level. So, but I think the primary thing we want to focus on is what people are doing and what people, rather than on what people are not doing, because that becomes the unfortunate thing. If we define religiosity only by what you do, and irreligiosity by what you don't do, we're in a lose-lose situation. And obviously also, so some Orthodox Jews might say, hey, this is good what she's doing, and she'll probably end up doing more. But the other great thing is, if you don't end up doing more, what you're doing is also very good. This is a very interesting insight, but then it's going to end with you because, because this is your evening. But it's a very interesting insight I came across, which surprised me in the book I wrote on the Rebbe, that when he started the tefillin campaign to get men, he was not pushing women on that case, to get men to put on tefillin, And for those of you who don't know what tefillin are, they're phylacteries. Now you know. Okay. Oddly enough, he got critiqued. Not oddly, it wasn't odd. He was critiqued. They were doing it in public, so he was critiqued among more secular or less observant Jews because they were uncomfortable, Jews putting on. But he also got critiqued in the segments of the right-wing Orthodox world because they said it's ridiculous. Somebody's going to put on tefillin and then he'll go into a diner and have cheese, ham and eggs or something. They saw no value unless it was part of the whole package. And the Rebbe actually responded, yes, just putting on the tefillin is a value in and of itself, even if it doesn't lead to other things. And I think, in a sense, that's one of the things you're communicating for Jews who are more observant than you and for Jews who are less observant than you. These things in and of themselves, whatever I've embraced, has had a real value.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
So I want to ask about, for me, my most uncomfortable moment every Passover. And I'm not sure I have the language right, but we always say, let all who are in need come and join us at our table. And every time it's said, or I say it, I feel that that's complete hypocrisy. That's not what we believe in. We wouldn't want to open our doors to homeless people. And I'd just like you to reflect on that and make any comment on it.
Well, it's something I actually raise as part of my questions at the table, unsolved, but I want to call it out too. So I appreciate that you struggle with it. And I think there are many moments when the language is not necessarily being borne out by the behavior. And the best that I have come up with is to at least think about it, not necessarily, and hopefully to be reaching out to the stranger in other ways if they are not actually at my table.
I have no particularly better answer than when you did. I mean, I'm also thinking there, what does it say? It says, let all who are hungry, and you're right. So have you made an effort to ensure that those people aren't? But your point is legitimate. By the way, I'm curious in light of it. I wouldn't normally ask a question back. What do you try and do as a result? Or do you? I'm not asking it to put you on the spot. It's a fair question.
I squirm.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things I would just say that when I was rereading Joseph's section on the holidays from Jewish literacy, is that he talked about something I didn't include, which I wish I had, which was that there is this ritual of making sure that anyone can afford a seder. Mm-hmm. I hadn't learned that before, and I think that, in a way, would be at least a pretty major step towards fulfilling the language you're mentioning, which I hadn't known before, that there actually is that.
Yeah, I suppose those are the two issues, right? One is, are you actually inviting people into your house? And the second is, are you making sure that people can have a seder? And by the way, the language is, let all who are hungry and let all who are needy. And Shai Agnon, who was the Israeli writer who won a Nobel Prize, wrote actually a story, just based that story on let all who are hungry and all who are needy. And hungry obviously applies to those too poor to eat. But the needy are those who have had losses, who now are alone in the world. And so it refers also to those who are emotionally needy. And can we think of somebody who might not otherwise have people with whom to share it, not necessarily for reasons of poverty, but for reasons of loneliness?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Abigail's daughter, so
She gets to ask a question.
Mom, at the JCC, you spoke about how you'd be less comfortable entering more conservative spaces had you not donned the cap of a reporter. So, Rabbi, I would ask you, do you think there is a space for the wanderer at the table, at the Shabbat table or the Passover table, or do you think there is an inherent exclusivity to the knowledge you need to participate?
Oh, my heavens, no, of course you want, let all who are hungry for knowledge also. No, you want everybody in. And I remember my friend Shlomo Riskin, always makes the point that he said, they always speak of the bad son. He said, at least the bad son showed up at the Seder. And who knows if after the response he got, he'll come back next year. We're talking about the people who aren't coming at all. That's the outreach. The biggest Seder every year is in Kathmandu. Like 1,100 people go. Because we didn't know how big a Jewish community there is in Nepal. No, actually it's because a lot of Israeli soldiers, after they get out of the army, go there And there's a Chabad seder there, where they bring mitzvahs. So this is the entry point. Michael Walzer makes the point that the Exodus story has influenced more movements of social change than any other story in literature. And I would argue that it would still have that effect. But if we Jews didn't keep the Seder, it would still have that effect, but we as a people wouldn't survive. These are the things that define us as a peoplehood. And oddly enough, peoplehood, no matter what one's theological convictions are, you have to recognize there's no way to become a Jew other than through the religion. There is no really secular way to join the Jewish people. There has to be some, and because part of Jewish religion is Jewish peoplehood. So we want everybody. Yes, we want it's a wonderful, in the nicest sense of the word, it's a wonderful learning experience.
Thank you.
You have time for a couple more
I just
questions.
have a question about just the whole notion of adding new holidays, because especially like holidays like Yom HaTzmaut, where a lot of people celebrate it, but there's a lot of this extreme Orthodox who don't recognize it as a holiday. They might not even recognize Yom HaShoah or some of the other holidays. So what do we say about adding new holidays, and then the ones that don't have too much meaning for us, maybe not celebrating them or commemorating them or whatever?
Okay.
You want to start that?
Okay, yeah. No, listen, I think that there are events. One could argue that you have the biblical period in Jewish life, then you have the first century, which was filled with an extraordinary number of very, very significant events, and the 20th century until now. And I think people do want to have some recognition of it. It gets back to the issue we discussed, but will those holidays survive as holidays if we don't give them some sort of religious content? And I think we have seen a decline, for example, and if you speak to older Americans, I'm 68, so when I think of older Americans, I don't think of myself, But I mean, if you speak to people who grew up before me, apparently there was a time when July 4th was a big deal in the United States. They really, and certainly if you go back to the late 19th century, it really was a big deal. And now it's a day off, and and for hot dogs and and things like that. Because I don't think you need some sort of a ritual and some sort of a sense of a higher purpose to it. So I think that's going to determine also, also what happens with these things. Because certainly, I would say Jews under 30, I do not think have anywhere near the same intensity of feeling about Israeli Independence Day as Jews in my age range, and Jews who are older than me even more so. And unless we find a way to endow it with something greater, it's not going to be observed. I don't think. It also reminds me of the story. Bellows says after he won the Nobel Prize, he met Agnon, and Agnon said, "Are any of your books translated into Hebrew?" And Bellows said, "Yes." Agnon said, "Okay, then you're assured of eternity." And because that's going to be around. Hebrew's going to be around, and the old holidays will be around. It's in our hands whether the new ones will.
Thank you, Abby, for writing this book and for your generosity in sharing what you've discovered. It's already just very inspiring to hear. Since you grew up with a feminist Tagada, I'm curious how your feminism has affected your experience of Judaism, the rituals, and the text.
Thank you. There's no question that my mother's trajectory, which was to be raised very observantly, to leave her observance behind for a while when she had a very seminal experience when she was excluded from being able to say mourner's Kaddish solely because she was female. And then when she came back to it, she had to find a Judaism that both echoed all the traditions and frankly very traditional rituals that my mother was used to, and yet also could feel comfortable in an egalitarian space, which is a long way of saying I lived through that trajectory, and it was it made its had its mark on me. I felt like there should be no other way, there could be no other way than to land where my mother landed, which was, I think people who assume that my mother has a crunchy Judaism are entirely wrong. It's a deep Judaism that is very much grounded in everything she learned as a child in Queens, and also everything that she co-created with what they call the Seder sisters in the 70s. But both are Judaism. And the fact that I am now at a synagogue with an Asian American rabbi, who's the first to be ordained as a female Asian American rabbi, who lit the menorah with President Obama at the White House Hanukkah party, is not lost on me. That we are in a different world, and it's a world I'm glad that my kids are growing up in. I would just say that in terms of this journey, there were times where the mechitza was a stumbling block. I went in not wanting to just make assumptions and have my sort of typical child of Letty response to the fact that there would be a divider, and sometimes that was possible, and sometimes that was very difficult. And I don't think it was just a feminist hat. It was entirely a Jewish response, which was feeling excluded at times that I couldn't believe that there would be that kind of divide.
So when didn't it bother you?
It didn't bother me at HIR, at a Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, because you've been there, I'm sure. It's organized, it's set up architecturally so that it's much more that the beam is in the center, and the wall is lower. Carlbach was harder.
Thank you. So I'm going to let Letty, as in Abigail's mom, ask the last question.
Oh, no.
Well, Ira took part of my question, because I was going to ask if there were moments when you really resented our tradition for its exclusionary impact in certain situations, but that you've covered. So first of all, I want to affirm the fact that at our seders, the kids cannot wait to come. I don't remember having that feeling as a child, ever. But the children in our family, and there are lots of them, and they all sit around the table, they say it's their favorite night of the year. Thanksgiving comes second when it comes to family events. So Abigail has made it so.
This is my publicist.
But my question now, because Ira has covered the sort of feminist area, is Rabbi Telushkin, would you be able to be who you are if you were who you are but born a woman?
This is a light ending.
Interestingly and oddly enough, I've never been asked that question quite like that, and the answer is probably not. Probably not. I think the Jewish community, without getting into the ritual areas, because I don't think the ritual areas, okay, I'm reflecting now a bit more while I'm conscious of the fact I'm also being videotaped, you know. I remember when the issues first started surfacing, you know, of women becoming rabbis. I was born in 1948, so it happened already when I was in my 20s, and full egalitarianism in the service. I remember thinking the following: I think it's important in the non-Orthodox world that this happened, and I wasn't as sure in the Orthodox world, and I'll tell you why I say that. For most non-Orthodox Jews, the synagogue represents a very primary expression of their Judaism. It is less so in the Orthodox world. For those who are actually Orthodox observant, their Judaism tends to be more. So it's not like I felt, so I felt that it was that any type of differentiation like that in the non-Orthodox world, I felt was much more injurious than it was in the Orthodox world, though the area where it bothered me most, not surprisingly in light of my opening comment, was in the area of study. Because in the Orthodox world, study and knowledge of texts is considered so basic to one's Jewishness that any discrimination in that area really puts somebody in an inferior position. You know, I'm not bothered by the fact, and I want to open it up to a whole long discussion, I'm not bothered by the fact that I can't get up in the synagogue in Duchen, you know, and do the priestly benediction. It doesn't, you know, that doesn't, so it doesn't, I'm not innately bothered by that in the same way about the rituals, maybe also, but anything in the realm of studying really, I think, bothered me. So could I have achieved what I had achieved? The answer is I'd be more likely to be able to achieve much of what I've achieved in today's world because of those changes. But I'm also meeting, Maharats. I'm meeting things are happening in the Orthodox world that are surprising, and even what you would call the right-wing Orthodox world, which I've seen it in effect. Obviously, the movement that I know best right now. I mean, first of all, I come out of Yeshiva University, but the other movement I know best, obviously, I spent 5 years working in the book on the Rebbe. Anybody who's had dealings in the world of Chabad knows that the Chabad shluchim, which are always a couple, they will never just send out a rabbi, a male rabbi. It's always a couple. They really do function as a partnership. So things are achieved in ways that are surprising. And so my innate, I'm like a more traditional version of you. I think both of us tend to be not that judgmental. And it's if I felt that there was a big sense of oppression among many women in the Orthodox world, which I think was the case when you were growing up. First of all, even then, it's horrible. Even then, there was precedent for women saying Kaddish. When I read that story about you in her book, I was so furious. And it was horrible. I mean, my grandfather encouraged it, and I know, and he was not coming exactly out of the most liberal of worlds. You can tell that obviously I had never been asked that question before because I did not have a very prepared sort of answer. So I'm sharing. As I always say in life, when somebody, I've on occasion asked people these really great questions that I knew, and it's true, the questions are always better than the answers because there is no exact answer, but it's a legitimate question, and I will think about it. And I don't think I want to write a book about it, but okay. Do I seem befuddled at the moment? Should I shut up already? I wish I could have answered. Calvin Coolidge was known for being very terse, so he came back from church. His wife said, "What did the minister speak about?" And Coolidge said, "Sin." And he said, "What did the minister say?" And he said he was against it. So I will finish with a terse answer. It's a good question, probably not, but I want to think about it more. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I want somebody from my family to start asking questions to her.
I want to give Abigail the last word.
I would just say that the main takeaway from this book, and I said this to Joseph before, is how many teachers came forward without hesitation. And that spoke, I think, most profoundly about the Jewish world to me. And it's what I'm going to carry with me, whatever holidays I choose to continue, is that when I called up a rabbi, they answered yes. And I end the book with that word that comes up in the Torah, obviously several times, Hineni, here I am. So many rabbis said, when I asked for help, here I am. And that is ultimately, I hope, the lesson of this journey. Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you so much. Are we done?
Thank you both so much. Abigail Pogrebin's new book, My Jewish Year, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew, is available for purchase and signing just outside. And Joseph Telushkin's Jewish Literacy and the Book of Jewish Values is also available for purchase and signing. Everyone is also invited to join us and RSVP for our upcoming public program on Tuesday, April 4th at 7:30 p.m. Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance Jr. will discuss criminal justice reform. Further information about this program and other programs is available on the table outside the auditorium. Thank you all for being here and for making this such an extraordinary evening.